one condemned commercial property at 118 Main Street, Ivanhoe, Minnesota. Assessed value $3,800, structure condemned. That was the line a parole officer read aloud to Curtis Rask. $38.87 in a paper bag, 3 weeks out of 7 years in prison. For stealing $2,400 worth of copper wire. The county owed him $12,000 for time. An appeals court said he never should have served. Instead of the cash, it handed him a condemned movie theater, 600 rotting seats, marquee, dark, 15 years. The clerk who processed the deed did not look up. Curtis took it because he needed an address for parole. Inside that theater, behind a wall the old projectionist had sealed, with 2-inch rigid conduit and a rooftop solar array, was something Richard Engdahl had been building for 40 years. Among the photographs was a folder with Curtis's name on it, pictures of himself at 17 that he never knew were taken. The parole officer's name was Dan Lundeen. He read the settlement letter aloud because Curtis Rask had asked him to. Not because Curtis could not read, but because he had learned in 7 years inside that a thing read aloud by someone else sounds different than a thing read alone. The difference is that you can hear the parts that do not make sense. One condemned commercial property, Lundeen read, at 118 Main Street, Ivanhoe, Minnesota, assessed value $3,800, structure condemned, property tax liability current, conveyed in lieu of partial cash settlement per attachment B. He looked up, and then $8,200 cash, to be dispersed upon endorsement of attached county check. He set the letter down on the desk between them. That's the deal. A building nobody wants and $8,200 in a check. Or you wait 18 months for the full $12,000. Curtis sat with his hands in his lap. He was 38. He had $87 in a paper bag in the inside pocket of a coat the prison had given him back 3 weeks earlier. The coat smelled like the box it had been stored in for 7 years, mothballs and cardboard and the particular flatness of a thing that has not been worn or aired in a long time. The check for $8,200 sat in the same pocket as the cash, unsigned. The check was real. The building, as far as Curtis could tell, was not real in any way that mattered. It was a condemned movie theater in a town he had not thought about in 20 years. It was offered by a county that owed him money and did not have it, and was trying to make the arithmetic come out by handing him something appraised at $3,800 that no one alive wanted. "Why a theater?" Curtis asked. Lundeen shrugged. "County owns it. Previous owner died, no heirs, back taxes. They've been trying to unload it for years. It was on the condemned list when they put the settlement together. Somebody in the assessor's office matched your name to the property file and figured it was worth a try. They matched my name how? I don't know. They needed to clear a liability and you needed to be paid. The building is the liability. You're the payment." Lundeen was not unkind about it, only tired. The way people in county offices are tired when they have done a thing so many times that the machinery of it has worn smooth and they no longer hear how it sounds. You need an address for your parole conditions. This gives you an address. It also gives you $8,200 in hand instead of waiting a year and a half for $12,000. That's real money, Curtis, right now. Curtis knew what $8,200 was. It was the difference between a man with nothing and a man with enough to eat and buy gas for 6 months. While he figured out what a 38-year-old ex-felon with a dead electrical apprenticeship and 7 years of nothing on his resume was supposed to do with the rest of his life. The $12,000, if he waited, would be the same thing plus a little more of the same thing. The difference was time, and time, for a man on parole with $87 and no address, was the thing he could not afford. "Where is Ivanhoe?" he asked. "Lincoln County, southwest corner. Out on the prairie, maybe 3 hours from here. 500 people, give or take. What's there?" "A grain elevator, a co-op, a school that consolidates with the next town over, and a condemned movie theater on Main Street that the county will give you for free if you sign this letter." Curtis signed the letter. He endorsed the check. He walked out of the Lincoln County offices in Marshall with $8,200 deposited into a checking account he had opened that morning at the credit union across the street. He had $87 cash in a paper bag in his coat, and a deed to a building he had never seen in a town he barely remembered from 2 summers pumping gas as a teenager. and a parole address that was, as far as he knew, a hole in a roof. He walked to the used car lot on the highway frontage road and wrote a check for $2,300 on the new account for a 2004 Chevrolet Silverado with 214,000 miles on it, the cheapest truck on the lot that ran, and drove it to Ivanhoe that afternoon. The heater worked, the radio did not. The tires were the kind of tires a man puts on a truck he expects someone else to worry about soon. They were worn past the wear bars on the inside edges and would not pass an inspection in a state that did inspections, which Minnesota did not. The engine knocked on cold starts. The transmission hesitated between second and third. The heater fan rattled at its highest setting. These were the sounds of a truck that would last a year if Curtis was careful and 6 months if he was not. He intended to be careful because $2,300 of the $8,200 was already gone into it, and he could not buy another. The drive from Marshall to Ivanhoe took 40 minutes on a 2-lane highway that ran straight west across the prairie. Curtis drove it in the late afternoon of a day in early March when the sun was already going down, and the fields on both sides of the road were still locked in snow. The snow was old, crusted, gray-white, the kind of snow that has been on the ground since November and will not leave until April. The sky was enormous and flat, and the color of spent dishwater, and there was nothing between the road and the horizon in any direction but fields and fence lines and the occasional stand of bare cottonwoods marking a farmstead. Ivanhoe came up out of the prairie, the way small towns come up in that part of Minnesota, which is to say it did not rise so much as it appeared, flat against flat, the grain elevator first and then the water tower and then the buildings themselves, low and square and pressed against the earth as though they had learned a long time ago not to stand too tall in the wind. Curtis had been here before, 2 summers, at 17 and 18, pumping gas at the mobile station on Main Street, a foster care placement that had sent him to a relative in Tyler who put him to work 12 miles away and never once drove out to check on him. He had not thought about Ivanhoe since. The town looked smaller than he remembered, and older, and the mobile station was gone, replaced by a bare concrete pad and a chain-link fence. He turned south onto Main Street and drove slowly, looking. Main Street was 4 blocks long. 3 of the storefronts were empty and had been for a while, the glass filmed over on the inside where no one had cleaned it from behind. A hardware store was open. A bar called the Cornerstone was open, its neon sign flickering in the window. A grain and feed co-op sat at the south end with 2 pickups parked out front. A white clapboard Lutheran church stood on the corner of Main and 2nd, with a sign that listed Sunday services at 9:30 and a Wednesday Bible study at 6. The street was plowed, but the sidewalks were not, except in front of the hardware store and the bar, and the snow along the curbs was piled waist-high and black with road grit. The Palace Theater was at the north end of Main. Curtis found it because the number was on the deed, and because it was the only building on the block that looked like it had stopped trying. It sat between a vacant lot where a building had been torn down and a small brick building that might have been a bank or a post office once and was now nothing. The theater's facade was brick, painted white a long time ago, the paint now chalked and peeling in long vertical strips that showed the red underneath. The marquee jutted out over the sidewalk on a steel frame, its letterboard empty, the bulb sockets dark, the underside of the marquee stained brown, where water had come through the flashing and run down the face of the sign for years. Below the marquee, a pair of double doors with wire glass panels, one of them boarded over with a sheet of plywood that had warped off its nails at the bottom. Above the marquee, centered in the brick, were the words Palace Theater in raised, concrete letters, 3 of which had broken off and fallen. What remained read Pa Ace the Tur. Curtis parked the truck at the curb and sat in it for a while with the engine running and the heater on, looking at the building he owned. It was the ugliest thing on a street that had a fair amount of competition, and it looked exactly like what it was, which was a building the county had been trying to give away for years, and had finally succeeded by attaching it to a man who needed an address badly enough to take anything. He got out. The cold hit him across the face like a flat hand. It was 9 below zero. The digital sign at the co-op had said, and the wind came straight across the prairie from the northwest, with nothing between it and the Canadian border but 300 miles of frozen field. Curtis was not dressed for it. The prison coat was nylon and thin. He had a hat from the same box, a knit watch cap with Minnesota DOC stenciled on the inside band in letters he had tried to scratch off with his thumbnail and had not entirely succeeded. He wore work boots he had bought at a Goodwill in Marshall for $8, the soles still good, the leather cracked at the flex points. The front doors were locked. He had a key, given to him by the county clerk along with the deed, a brass key on a paper tag that said 118 Main and nothing else. The key turned hard. The lock was frozen, or nearly, and he had to work it, jiggling, leaning his weight into the door. When it finally let go, the door swung inward with a sound like a seal breaking, a gasp of air that was somehow colder inside than out, if that was possible, a cold that had been sitting undisturbed for years and had settled into the building the way dust settles. The lobby was small and dark. His boots on the tile floor sounded loud in the silence. He took out his phone and turned on the flashlight, and the beam cut through air thick with dust motes that hung motionless, undisturbed until he had opened the door and let the draft in. A concession counter ran along the left wall, the glass case cracked, the popcorn machine still sitting on top of it with its kettle hanging open like a jaw. A carpeted ramp led up to the auditorium doors, the carpet a red that had gone to a muddy brown, worn to the backing along the center path. On the wall behind the concession counter, a framed poster for a movie Curtis did not recognize. The paper buckled and foxed. A rat had chewed a hole through the lower right corner. He pushed through the auditorium doors. The smell hit him first. Damp. Old fabric. The mineral smell of concrete that has been wet and dried and wet again for years. Mold. The sharp, sweet smell of it, coming from everywhere and nowhere. His flashlight swept 600 seats in rows that curved gently from wall to wall, climbing the raked floor toward the back. The seats were the old spring-loaded kind. The upholstery a dark red velvet that had gone gray with dust in some sections and black with mildew in others. Several had collapsed, their springs broken, the seat bottoms hanging down like open mouths. Water stains ran down the right wall in long brown streaks from a point near the ceiling where the roof had failed, and the plaster along that streak had bubbled and fallen away in patches, showing the lath underneath. The screen at the front was intact but stained, a gray rectangle in the flashlight beam, with a watermark spreading from the upper left corner, like a continent on a map nobody wanted. Curtis stood at the top of the center aisle and looked at 600 seats in the dark and felt nothing he could name. He was not disappointed, because he had expected nothing. He was not hopeful, because hope was a thing he had stopped carrying somewhere around year 3 inside, when he understood that the appeal was going nowhere fast, and that the 7 years were his to serve whether the enhancement held or not. He was cold. He was tired. He owned a building that smelled like mold and dead carpet, and the building gave him an address, and the address kept him out of a halfway house in Marshall, and that was the whole of the transaction. He did not need it to be more than that. He slept in the truck that first night, parked at the curb in front of the theater, the engine running for heat because 9 below zero in a truck with no blankets is not a thing you survive without the engine. The gas gauge dropped a quarter tank by morning, which was $4. He could not afford to spend every night and would have to figure out. In the morning, stiff, his breath frozen on the inside of the windshield, he went back inside the theater and started the only kind of work he knew how to do. He checked the electrical panel first. That was instinct, the apprentice electrician in him still alive under 7 years of concrete and fluorescent light, and nothing to wire but the inside of his own head. The main panel was in a utility closet off the lobby, a Federal Pacific breaker box from 1952 with a 200-amp main that had been turned off. The box was original to the building. Stab lock breakers, the old kind that were a fire hazard and had been for decades, but that was a problem for a building that had power, and this building did not. The meter outside was pulled. No utility account, no power. Curtis expected that. A building condemned for 15 years does not have power. He moved on. He spent the first 2 days with a flashlight, walking every room. The lobby, the auditorium, the 2 restrooms with their cracked fixtures and dry P-traps that let the sewer gas up, so that the men's room smelled like a thing Curtis did not want to think about. A manager's office behind the concession counter, empty except for a desk with 1 leg broken and a calendar on the wall open to a month in 2009. A storage room full of nothing. A narrow staircase at the back of the lobby that led up to the projection booth. The projection booth door was padlocked. The padlock was a master, brass, weathered but solid, and Curtis did not have a key for it and did not force it, because a man on parole for copper theft does not break locks in condemned buildings, not even his own. He went back down. On the third day, he called the co-op and had the propane tank behind the theater checked. It was a 500-gallon tank, rusted but sound, and it had 11% in it, which was 55 gallons, which was enough to run the furnace for a few weeks if the furnace worked. Curtis found the furnace in a mechanical room below the stage, a Lennox forced air unit from the 1970s, and he spent 4 hours cleaning the burners and checking the gas line and replacing a thermocouple he bought from the hardware store for $14. The blower needed electricity, so he bought a small portable generator at a pawn shop in Tyler for $65 and ran an extension cord down to the furnace. When he fired it up, the blower screamed for 10 seconds and then settled into a rattle that meant a bearing was going but would hold for a while. Warm air began moving through the building for the first time in 15 years, and the smell of it was the smell of burning dust. The smell of every heating system that comes back from the dead, which is the smell of everything that has settled on every surface for years suddenly being cooked off into the air. Curtis opened the front doors to let it clear and stood in the cold while the building warmed, and a woman walking past on the sidewalk looked at the open doors and the lights of his flashlight inside and crossed to the other side of the street. He had not told anyone in Ivanhoe who he was, which meant they already knew. That is how small towns work. A man arrives in a truck with out-of-county plates and parks it in front of the condemned theater and goes inside with a key, and by nightfall the hardware store and the bar and the co-op have all heard about it. What they have heard is not the settlement or the appeals court, or the fact that the copper was worth $2,400, and Curtis served 7 years for it. What they have heard is, ex-con, electrician, copper theft, 3 words. In a town of 500 people, 3 words is a whole biography. Curtis Rask had been 31 when he was arrested. He had been working as an apprentice electrician for Bayer Electric out of Marshall, 3 years into a 4-year apprenticeship, wiring a strip mall project on the east side of town. The work was good. He was good at it. He could read a print and pull wire and bend conduit and terminate a panel, and his journeyman, a man named Kolvek, had told him once that he had the hands for it, which was the closest thing to a compliment Kolvek gave. Curtis had grown up in foster care in Wilmar, aged out at 18, drifted through a decade of nothing jobs, and found the apprenticeship through a vocational program at the community college. For the first time in his life, something fit. Electrical work was logic made physical. A circuit was a sentence with a subject and a verb and a ground. And Curtis, who had never been good at talking to people and had never been good at school, was good at following the logic of a circuit from the panel to the load and back. He could look at a junction box and see the whole building's nervous system the way other people look at a map and see a landscape. On a Friday night in October, at the end of a long week on the strip mall job, Curtis and 2 other apprentices went back to the site after hours and stripped copper wire from the building. It was not Curtis's idea. He would not claim it was. He went along because he was 31 and broke, and because the 2 other men told him the wire was scrap. Left over, going to the dumpster anyway, and because he wanted to believe that was true and did not check. They loaded the wire into a truck and drove it to a scrapyard in Redwood Falls that did not ask questions, and the 3 of them split $412. Curtis's share was $137. The total value of the copper, by the contractor's accounting, was $2,400. The contractor filed a report Monday morning. The 2 other apprentices gave Curtis's name first. He was arrested at the job site Tuesday, standing on a ladder with a spool of Romex in his hand, and the officer who arrested him made a joke about it that Curtis heard and did not respond to and thought about every day for 7 years. The charge was theft, Class C felony, which in Minnesota carried a presumptive sentence of up to 5 years. But the strip mall project was under construction as a medical clinic, and the county attorney's office filed a critical infrastructure enhancement under a statute that had been written for people who stole copper from power substations and cell towers, and applied it to a building that was not yet a building, and the enhancement elevated the sentencing range. Curtis was given 7 years. The 2 other apprentices, who cooperated, received probation. He filed an appeal from inside. It worked its way through the courts for 6 years, and the ruling came down 11 months after Curtis had already walked out the gate, having served the full 7. The appeals court threw out the enhancement, ruling that a building under construction did not qualify as critical infrastructure under the statute. By then it did not matter. The base charge carried a maximum of 5 years. Curtis had served 7. He did not fight, because by year 3 there was nothing in him that fought. He had learned that the system did not work the way a circuit works, where the logic goes one direction and the ground brings you home. The system worked the way water works in a building with a failed roof, which is to say it goes wherever gravity takes it, and gravity does not care about logic. The over-incarceration settlement was the state's admission that the enhancement should not have been applied. $12,000 for 2 years of a man's life that the state took and could not give back. Curtis did not know what 2 years of his life were worth, but he knew it was not $12,000, and he knew it was not a condemned theater in a town he could barely remember, and he also knew that $87 and no address is a number that does not allow a man the luxury of being insulted by what is offered. So here he was, in Ivanhoe, Minnesota, in a building that smelled like mold and dead mice, and 15 years of stillness, with the furnace running and the truck parked out front, and the whole town knowing exactly 3 things about him, none of them good. He lived in the manager's office that first week. He dragged in a sleeping bag from the truck, and a Coleman camping pad he bought at the hardware store for $22, and he slept on the floor behind the desk with the broken leg. The furnace kept the room warm enough that he did not need to run the truck. He ate canned soup he heated on a single-burner camp stove, and he drove to the grocery in Tyler, 12 miles east, every 3 days for water and food. And he kept track of every dollar in a pocket notebook because he had learned in prison that a man who does not know his number does not have a number. He just has less than he did yesterday. By the end of the first week in Ivanhoe, his checking account was down to $5,800. The truck had taken $2,300 before he left Marshall. The thermocouple was $14. The generator was $65. The sleeping pad was $22. Gas, food, the notebook, a flashlight, a set of batteries, 2 pairs of wool socks from the hardware store at $4 a pair. He wrote every figure down. He had started with $8,287, and in 7 days he had spent $2,500 and some, and the rate of spending was too fast, and he knew it, and he did not know how to make it slower without stopping eating, and he was not going to stop eating. What he needed was work. What he had was a condemned theater, an expired electrical apprenticeship, and a felony conviction for stealing copper wire, which meant that no electrical contractor in the state of Minnesota would hire him, and no licensing board would issue him a journeyman's card, and the one skill he had was the one skill the world had decided he could not be trusted with. That was the geometry of his life, and it had no solution he could see, and he did not dwell on it, because dwelling was another thing he had stopped doing around year 3. On the 9th day in the theater, Curtis walked the outside of the building. He had been inside it for a week. He had walked every room with a flashlight and a notebook, making a list of what was broken and what was not, which was a long list on one side and a short one on the other. He had not yet been outside, not properly, not the way an electrician walks the outside of a building, which is to say looking up and looking at the walls and looking at where the service enters and where the conduit runs and how the ground is bonded. He had been too cold and too busy and too focused on making the inside livable to look at the outside. Now, on a morning when the sun came out for the first time in days and the temperature climbed to 4 above zero, which in Ivanhoe in March qualifies as mild, he walked the perimeter. The east wall faced Main Street. Service entrance, meter socket, the pulled meter. Nothing unexpected. The south wall faced the vacant lot. Nothing. The north wall backed up to the alley. The propane tank, a condensing unit for an air conditioner that would never run again. A dumpster for enclosure with no dumpster. Nothing. The west wall faced a narrow strip of dead grass, and then the back of the next building over. And on the west wall, about 7 feet off the ground, bolted to the brick with galvanized straps, was a piece of conduit that did not belong there. Curtis saw it from 20 feet away and stopped walking. He stood in the frozen grass, with his hands in his coat pockets, and looked at it the way he used to look at a junction box on a job site when something about it was wrong, and he had not yet figured out what. It was rigid metal conduit, 2-inch, galvanized steel, not the gray PVC they run on residential work. 2-inch rigid is heavy conduit, serious conduit, the kind you use for a commercial service entrance or a heavy feeder run, rated for pulling 4/0 copper or aluminum wire for a load of 100 amps or better. It ran horizontally along the west wall for about 12 feet, supported by 3 galvanized straps bolted into the brick, and it entered the wall through a neatly drilled penetration that had been sealed with fire-rated caulk, the red kind. At the near end, the conduit came down the wall and connected to a junction box mounted at about 5 feet, and below the junction box, bolted to a treated 4x4 post sunk in the ground, was a ground rod, and above the junction box, a small breaker panel, a 100-amp breaker panel, on the outside of a condemned building, with a ground rod. Curtis walked up to it. He put his hand on the conduit and felt it, the way an electrician feels conduit, which is to run a thumb along the fitting and check the coupling and read the gauge by the weight of it in the hand. 2-inch rigid, heavy, real. The couplings were tight. The straps were level. The junction box was a NEMA 3R, the weatherproof kind. The breaker panel was a square DQO, a quality panel, the kind an electrician who cares about his work installs, not the cheap builder-grade panels you find in tract houses. The ground rod was copper-clad 8 feet, driven to grade, with a number 4 bare copper wire clamped to it with an acorn clamp and running up into the panel. This was new work, not 1952, not even close. The conduit was clean, no rust, no oxidation, the galvanizing still bright under a thin film of dirt. The caulk around the wall penetration was still flexible, not cracked. The ground rod clamp was not corroded. This installation was maybe 5 years old, maybe 10. But it was not the kind of wiring that had been on this building when it was built. And it was not the kind of wiring that belonged on a condemned building, with no utility account and no meter. And the panel was live. Curtis opened the panel cover with his thumbnail, the way you do when you do not have a screwdriver, and the cover is held by a quarter-turn latch. Inside, a 100-amp main breaker, in the on position, and below it 2 20-amp breakers feeding circuits that ran up through the conduit and into the wall. The main breaker had a yellow flag showing in its indicator window. Live, current flowing. He closed the panel cover. He stepped back. He looked up at the wall above the conduit, and then up at the roof, and that was when he saw the solar panels. They were on the west side of the roof, which was why he had not seen them from Main Street. 4 panels, maybe 100 watts each, mounted on an aluminum frame that was bolted to the roof structure with lag bolts, angled south to catch the winter sun. The wiring ran down from the panels in weatherproof conduit to a small charge controller mounted on the wall above the breaker panel, and from the controller down into the panel. The panels were not new, but they were not old. They were the kind of mid-range residential panels you could buy online 10 years ago for $200 or $300 each. A 400-watt solar array on the roof of a condemned movie theater that had been dark for 15 years. A 100-amp breaker panel on the west wall, live, with a ground rod and 2-inch rigid conduit feeding into the building through a sealed penetration. And no utility account, no meter. The power was coming from the sun stored in batteries somewhere inside and feeding something behind the west wall of a building that, according to the county, had nothing in it worth saving. Curtis knew what 100 amps fed. He had wired 100-amp services as an apprentice. 100 amps at 240 volts is 24 kilowatts, which is enough to run a house, or a small commercial kitchen, or a workshop full of equipment, or a climate control system that keeps a room at a specific temperature year-round. It is not the kind of load you install for a light bulb and a space heater. It is the kind of load you install because there is something on the other end that draws real power. And you want that thing to stay running, whether anyone is watching or not. The conduit went into the west wall of the theater. On the other side of the west wall, as far as Curtis had seen from inside, there was nothing. The auditorium seats ran to within 4 feet of the west wall, and between the last row of seats and the wall there was a narrow aisle, and on the wall there was plaster, painted the same dark red as the rest of the auditorium, and no visible outlets, no visible fixtures, no visible anything. 100 amps of power, from a solar array with a battery bank, feeding through 2-inch rigid conduit into a wall, and coming out on the other side into nothing. Curtis stood in the frozen grass on the west side of the Palace Theater, and did the arithmetic that no developer, no appraiser, no county assessor, and no condemned building inspector had done in 15 years, which was to look at the wiring on the outside and ask what it fed on the inside, and get an answer that did not add up. He went back inside. He walked to the west wall of the auditorium and stood in the narrow aisle behind the last row of seats and put his hand flat on the plaster. It was cold. He knocked on it, lightly with his knuckles, the way you knock on a wall when you want to know what is behind it. The sound came back solid, not hollow. Solid, the way a wall sounds when there is something on the other side, not just a stud cavity with insulation but a mass, a room, something that gives the wall weight. He knocked again, lower, and the sound was the same. He moved 3 feet to the right and knocked, and the sound changed. Higher, thinner. The stud cavity there was empty. He moved back to the left and knocked, and the sound went solid again. There was something behind this wall that took up about 12 feet of its length, and the something was not in the original plan of the building, because the original plan of a 1952 movie theater does not include a room behind the auditorium's west wall. The auditorium was supposed to go right up to the exterior brick. There should have been nothing between the plaster and the outside, but studs and brick, and the cold March air. Instead, there was mass, and the mass was being fed 100 amps of solar power through 2-inch rigid conduit. And the conduit entered the wall at a point that lined up exactly with the 12-foot section that sounded solid. Curtis went upstairs. The projection booth was at the top of the narrow staircase, behind the padlocked door. He had not forced it. He still did not force it. But next to the projection booth door, on the landing, was a smaller door, the kind that leads to a mechanical chase or an attic access, and this one was not locked. It was latched with a simple hook and eye, the hook corroded nearly shut. He worked it loose with his fingers and pulled the door open. Behind it was a crawl space, maybe 3 feet high, running along the top of the auditorium wall. It was full of dust and dead flies, and the desiccated body of a starling that had gotten in and never gotten out. Curtis got on his hands and knees and crawled in with his phone flashlight, and the beam fell on conduit. The 2-inch rigid came through the exterior wall and ran along the top of the crawl space, supported by straps bolted to the joists, and it dropped down through the floor of the crawl space into the wall below. He followed it with the flashlight. Where it dropped through the floor, there was a hole cut neatly through the subfloor and the lath, and the conduit went down into what should have been the back of the auditorium wall, but was, from this angle, clearly the top of a space. He could see through the gap where the conduit penetrated the faint glow of an indicator light. Green. Something down there was powered on and running. He backed out of the crawl space and went downstairs and stood in the auditorium again and looked at the west wall and thought. He was an electrician, not a carpenter. But he knew walls. He knew that a wall with a 100-amp feed going into it and a green indicator light on the other side was a wall with a purpose, and the purpose was not to hold up plaster. He also knew that a man on parole for copper theft, standing in a condemned building, pulling open walls and tracing conduit, was a man who looked exactly like he was doing the thing he had been convicted of doing. The irony was not lost on him. It was, in fact, the central irony of his life, that the one thing he was good at, the one thing that let him see what no one else in 15 years had seen, was the same thing the world had decided made him untrustworthy. He opened the wall anyway, not with a sledgehammer, not the way a thief opens a wall, which is fast and loud and does not care about what is on the other side. He opened it the way an electrician opens a wall when he needs to find a wire, which is to say carefully, methodically, starting at the conduit penetration on the outside and working inward. He went to the hardware store and bought a drywall saw for $6 and a pry bar for $9, and he came back and cut a 12 by 12-inch square in the plaster next to where the conduit entered from above, and he pulled the square free, and behind the plaster was not the back of the brick exterior wall. Behind the plaster was drywall, another layer of wall, fire-rated, 5/8 inch, the purple kind, Type X, the kind you use when code requires a fire barrier or when you are building a room inside a room and you want it to last. Someone had built a wall inside the west wall of the Palace Theater. A fire-rated wall, properly finished, with taped joints and a coat of primer. Between the plaster of the auditorium and this new wall was a 3-inch gap, just enough for the conduit to run through, and the conduit dropped down through this gap and entered the fire-rated wall through another sealed penetration. And on the other side of the fire-rated wall was a space that Curtis could not yet see but could now feel, because when he put his hand through the hole he had cut, the air on the other side was different. Warmer, drier, climate-controlled. He cut a larger opening, He worked slowly. The drywall saw rasped through the fire-rated board, and the sound was loud in the empty auditorium, and he stopped every few minutes and listened, because the habit of listening for footsteps does not leave a man after 7 years of needing to. When the opening was big enough to step through, about 3 feet square, he leaned in with his flashlight and looked. The room was roughly 12 feet wide and 20 feet deep, running along the inside of the west wall from a point behind the back rows of the auditorium to a point that Curtis estimated was directly below the projection booth. The floor was plywood, laid over the original concrete, with rubber-backed carpet on top of it, the kind you put in a dark room or a server room to control static. The walls were the fire-rated drywall, insulated, finished, painted a flat off-white. The ceiling was low, maybe 7 feet, framed with 2x6s, and insulated above with fiberglass bats that Curtis could see through a gap where a ceiling tile had shifted. The room had no windows. The only light was the green glow of a charge controller mounted on the far wall, and a red standby light on a dehumidifier, and the faint blue light of a digital thermometer reading 57 degrees. 57 degrees. In a building where the auditorium was 38, and the outside was 4 above zero. The solar panels and the battery bank were feeding a small climate control system that kept this room at a constant temperature, year-round, regardless of the weather, regardless of the fact that the building had been condemned and the front doors had been locked for 15 years, and no one knew this room existed. Richard Engdahl had built a room that kept itself alive. Curtis stepped through the opening. His boots on the carpeted floor were quiet after the bare concrete of the auditorium. He swept the flashlight. Against the far wall, along its full length, stood 4 filing cabinets. Steel, 4-drawer, the heavy kind, the color of putty. They were labeled with masking tape in a hand that was small and careful, and the labels were years. 1968 to 1972, 1973 to 1977, 1978 to 1982. The sequence went all the way across 4 cabinets, 16 drawers, 40 years. Along the right wall, a workbench. On the workbench, 3 enlargers, the old photographic kind, the kind that project a negative onto light-sensitive paper and make a print. Trays for developer and stop bath and fixer, stacked neatly dry, with a faint chemical smell that Curtis did not recognize, but that was sharp and astringent. The smell of photographic chemistry that has dried in its trays but not been washed out. A safe light, the red filtered kind, tongs. Bottles of chemicals, some full empty, all labeled in the same careful hand. A paper cutter. A drying rack, the kind that holds prints flat between sheets of blotter paper. A dark room. A complete functioning photographic dark room, built inside the west wall of a condemned movie theater, powered by solar panels, climate-controlled, and full of filing cabinets labeled by year. Curtis opened the first drawer of the first cabinet. Inside, hanging in green suspension folders, were negatives, thousands of them. Strips of 35mm film in clear plastic sleeves, organized by date, each sleeve labeled in the same small handwriting. He did not touch them. He opened the second drawer. Prints. 8x10 black and white prints, filed upright in manila folders, each folder labeled with a name or a date or a subject. He pulled one folder at random. It was labeled Ivanhoe Lutheran, Confirmation Class 1974. Inside were 12 prints, sharp, well-exposed, carefully printed, of teenagers in white robes standing in front of a church altar. He did not recognize any of the faces. He pulled another folder. Flood, Spring 1978. Photographs of water standing in the streets of Ivanhoe, of sandbags stacked against the doors of buildings on Main Street, of men in hip waders carrying furniture out of a house, of a woman sitting on the roof of a car with a child in her lap and water up to the door handles. The prints were beautiful. Not in the way a gallery photograph is beautiful, with its deliberate composition and its carefully controlled light. Beautiful in the way a thing is beautiful when it is true. When the person holding the camera cared about what was in front of them and knew how to hold the moment still. He opened drawer after drawer, filed under years, under names, under occasions, christenings, graduations, funerals, a county fair, the midway at dusk, the lights on the Ferris wheel blurred by a long exposure, a boy on a tractor, squinting into the sun. An old woman in a garden, her hands in the dirt, looking up with an expression that was not posed, and was not candid, but was something in between. The expression of a person who knows they are being photographed, and has decided to let it happen. A basketball game in a gymnasium, the ball frozen in the air, the shooter's hand still extended. A dog asleep on a sidewalk, a barn on fire, the flames lighting the underside of the smoke from below, and in the foreground, 4 men with their backs to the camera, watching it burn. 40 years of a town. Every christening, every graduation, every funeral, every flood. Every quiet afternoon when nothing happened, except that someone was there with a camera and cared enough to make a record of it. Thousands of photographs, tens of thousands of negatives, organized and filed and preserved in a room no one knew existed by a man who had spent his life running movies for the people of Ivanhoe and had, in secret, been photographing the same people from behind his projector, and out the front doors of his theater and across the street, and at every public gathering for 4 decades. Richard Engdahl, the projectionist. Curtis had seen the name on the deed on the county record, the previous owner who had died with no heirs and no will and nothing left behind, that the county thought was worth keeping. A projections man. A man who ran a movie theater for 40 years and maintained the equipment, and kept the lights on, and sold the tickets and showed the films and went home at night, and no one knew he was doing this. No one knew he was building an archive of their own lives, negative by negative, print by print, filed away in the dark, behind a wall he had built himself, in a room he had powered with his own money and his own wiring and his own hands. Curtis sat down on the carpet in the middle of the room, between the filing cabinets and the darkroom bench, and held a photograph of a woman he did not know hanging laundry on a line in the sun, and he did not know what to do with what he had found. He was a man with a felony, in a condemned building, behind a wall he had just cut open, holding another man's photographs. He did not know who the woman was, or who the photographer was, or why any of it was here. He only knew that it was the most deliberate thing he had ever seen, that a man had spent 40 years doing this in secret, and that the room smelled like chemistry and dust, and the particular stillness of a place that has been waiting, patiently, for someone to open it. He spent the next 2 days in the hidden room, going through the filing cabinets drawer by drawer, slowly, the way you go through something when you do not yet understand what it is, and are afraid of disturbing the order of it. He did not remove the photographs from their folders. He opened each folder, looked at the prints inside, read the label, closed it, and moved on. He was mapping the archive in his mind, the way he used to map a building's electrical system before he pulled a single wire, circuit by circuit, panel by panel, until he could see the whole thing. The archive was organized by year and, within each year, by subject. Some subjects were events. The county fair, the 4th of July parade, the school Christmas program, a wedding, a funeral. Some were families. The Lindgrens, the Schmichts, the Olsons, the Nguyens, names that meant nothing to Curtis but that he could tell, by the volume of the folders, were the central families of the town. Some were places, Main Street in different seasons, the grain elevator at dawn, the co-op in the rain, the Lutheran church in the snow, and some set apart from the rest in the last drawer of the last cabinet, were labeled not by year or subject but by a single name, a name that appeared nowhere else in the archive. David. Curtis opened the folder. Inside were photographs of a young man, tall, dark-haired, lean, maybe 20, in jeans and a denim jacket. The photographs were different from the others. The others were a town historian's work, steady and composed, taken by a man who cared about the record. These were a father's photographs. They were taken closer. They were taken with the kind of attention that is not about composition but about preservation, about holding a face still so that it cannot change, cannot age, cannot leave. David at the lake, knee-deep in water, looking back over his shoulder with a grin that was half a dare. David at the Lincoln County Fair, leaning against a fence post, eating something off a stick. David on a motorcycle, a Honda, the kind of bike a young man buys when he has just enough money to make a mistake with. And David had both hands on the grips and was looking straight into the camera, and the look on his face was the look of a person who is about to go somewhere and has not yet learned that some distances do not close. There were maybe 60 photographs of David. They ended abruptly. The last one was dated in the small, careful hand. August 1979. After that, the folder was empty, and the emptiness was not the emptiness of a folder that has not been filled. It was the emptiness of a thing that stopped. Curtis did not know who David was. He did not yet know the story. He set the folder carefully back in its place and continued. Behind the David folder in the same drawer was another folder. It was thinner, maybe 20 photographs, and it was labeled in the same hand, but the label was not a name. The label read, "Boy at the Mobile." Curtis opened it, and for the first time in the 2 weeks since he had arrived in Ivanhoe, he felt something that was not cold, not fatigue, not the flat gray patience of a man getting through his day. He felt the floor tilt. The photographs were of a young man pumping gas. The young man was maybe 17, maybe 18, thin, wearing a blue mobile jacket with the name patch on the chest, and he was standing at the pumps of the mobile station that used to sit across Main Street from the Palace Theater, the same station that was now a bare concrete pad and a chain-link fence, the same station where Curtis Rask had worked for 2 summers before he moved to Wilmar, before the apprenticeship, before everything. He recognized himself before he recognized the station. You do not expect to see your own face in a photograph you did not know was taken, and the shock of it is not vanity but dislocation, the feeling of being moved without consent from the present into a version of yourself that no longer exists. He had been 17. He had been pumping gas. He had been a kid with no family and no plan and no idea that 14 years later he would be standing on a ladder with a spool of wire in his hand and an officer behind him with a joke. And across the street, from the front window of the Palace Theater, someone had been photographing him. The photographs were taken from a distance, through glass, slightly blurred at the edges, the way a telephoto shot through a window is blurred when the glass is not perfectly clean. Curtis pumping gas. Curtis leaning against the pump island, eating a sandwich, his legs stretched out on the curb. Curtis fixing something on the pump, bent over with a wrench, his hair falling in his face. Curtis standing still, looking at nothing, the way a boy stands when he is between tasks and does not know anyone is watching. And tucked behind the photographs, folded, was a sheet of lined paper torn from a pocket notebook, covered in the same small careful handwriting that labeled everything in the archive. Curtis unfolded it and read it. Standing in the hidden room behind the west wall of the Palace Theater, in the green glow of the charge controller, and the words on the paper were these. The boy in the mobile jacket. He has David's hands. The same reach. He leans against the pump the way David used to lean against the fence post, one shoulder up, like the world is something he hasn't decided whether to carry yet. I don't know his name. I have never spoken to him. But I have watched him for 2 summers now, and he is the closest thing to seeing David again that I will ever have. I photograph him because I cannot stop. I photograph everything because if I photograph everything, nothing else can disappear the way David disappeared. The camera is the only thing I have that holds things still. A second entry, below it, in a shakier version of the same hand. They arrested him this morning. The boy from the mobile. I saw it from the window. 2 officers in a squad car, and the boy standing very still the way David stood still when he was frightened, which was not often but was terrible to see. Just like David, always reaching for the wrong thing. Curtis read it twice. He folded the paper and put it back behind the photographs, and closed the folder and stood in the room and did not move for a long time. Richard Engdahl had seen him. 20 years ago, a man Curtis barely noticed, the projectionist in the building across the street, had looked out his window and seen a boy pumping gas and seen his own son in him. Not known him, not spoken to him, not introduced himself or offered help or asked his name, just watched, just photographed. Just written in a notebook that the boy at the gas station had the same hands as the boy who had ridden away on a motorcycle in August of 1979 and never come back. And that watching the boy at the gas station was the closest thing to watching David that Richard Engdahl would ever have again. And that the camera was how he held things still, because the world would not hold still on its own. And then Curtis had been arrested, and Richard had watched that too, from the same window, and had written it down the same way, with the same grief he had been carrying for 25 years, as though the boy at the mobile and the boy on the motorcycle were the same boy and the world kept taking him. Curtis did not cry. He was not a man who cried easily, and he had not cried in prison, and he had not cried at his sentencing, and he had not cried when he walked out the gate, after 7 years, with $87 and nothing waiting. But he sat down on the floor of Richard Engdahl's hidden room and pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes and sat there. And the room was warm and quiet and dark, except for the green light of the charge controller, and the building above him was cold and empty and condemned, and he sat between the two, in the space the dead man had built, and he understood for the first time in his life that he had been seen, not known, seen, by a stranger through a window, from across the street. by a man who had lost his son and found something in Curtis's hands and reach, and the way he leaned against a gas pump that was enough for a grieving father to keep the camera pointed. It was not love, exactly. It was something that ran parallel to love, the way a highway runs parallel to a river, close enough to see, too far to touch. Richard Engdahl had not saved Curtis, had not helped him, had not spoken to him or intervened or sent a lawyer or written a letter. He had only seen him and written it down and filed it and kept the room warm. If you have made it this far into Curtis Rask's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next, when the town that already knows 3 things about him sees him pulling wiring and cutting open walls in a condemned building, is the part I have been waiting to tell you. The trouble started on a Thursday. Curtis had been in the hidden room for 4 days, going through the cabinets, reading Richard Engdahl's notes, trying to understand the scope of what he had found. He had left the cut-open section of the auditorium wall as it was, a 3-foot square hole with raw drywall edges, because he did not know how to close it and did not think anyone would see it. The theater was his building. The doors were locked. He was the only person with a key. But he had also, over those 4 days, gone back to the exterior of the building several times to study the conduit and the solar panels and the wiring, because the electrician in him could not leave it alone, and because he wanted to understand how Richard had built the system. He had opened the breaker panel. He had traced the ground rod. He had climbed up onto the roof, using a ladder he borrowed from the alley behind the hardware store, and looked at the solar panel mounting. He had been on the roof for 20 minutes, crouching next to the panels, following the wiring with his eyes, when he heard a voice from the street below. "What are you doing up there?" He looked down. A man in a county truck was standing on the sidewalk, looking up. Curtis did not recognize him. He was maybe 50, in a Carhartt coat and a Lincoln County cap. "I own this building," Curtis said. "I know who you are," the man said. He did not say it with hostility. He said it with the particular flatness of a man delivering information. "You're the one from Marshall, the settlement." A pause. "People are talking." "About what?" "About the wiring. Jerry Ellison at the hardware store says you bought a pry bar and a drywall saw. And Karen Olson across the street says she's seen you on the roof twice this week working on the electrical. And people know what you were in for." Curtis stood on the roof of his own building into the cold and heard himself being described, and the description was accurate in every physical detail and wrong in every inference, and there was nothing he could say from a rooftop to a stranger on the sidewalk that would make the gap between the two any smaller. He came down. The man in the county truck drove away. Curtis went inside and locked the door and stood in the auditorium in the dark, next to the hole he had cut in the wall, and thought about what was about to happen. It happened the next day. The sheriff's deputy came at 10 in the morning, a young woman named Osberg, who was polite and careful, and who told Curtis that a complaint had been filed, not a formal charge, just a concern, from a resident who believed that the new owner of the Palace Theater was stripping copper wire from the building. The resident had seen him on the roof near the electrical panels. The resident knew about his prior conviction. The deputy asked if she could come inside and look. Curtis let her in. He had nothing to hide, which was not the same thing as having nothing that looked bad. The deputy walked the building with him. She saw the auditorium. She saw the hole in the wall. She saw the conduit running into the wall and the drywall edges, and the pry bar in the drywall saw leaning against the seats where he had left them. She did not go through the hole into the hidden room. She looked at it, and at Curtis, and she said she was going to have to file a report. "I'm not stripping anything," Curtis said. "I'm tracing a wire." "I understand that may be what you're doing," the deputy said. She was not unkind. She was 26 maybe, and she was doing her job. And her job was to look at an ex-felon with a copper theft conviction, standing in a condemned building next to a hole in a wall, with electrical tools in his hands, and make a judgment. The judgment she made was the one the system required her to make, which was to write it down and send it up. "But I have to put this in the report, Mr. Rask. Your parole officer is going to get a copy." Dan Lundeen called that afternoon. Curtis sat in the manager's office on the sleeping bag and listened to his parole officer tell him, in the same tired voice he had used to read the settlement letter, that a complaint had been filed and that a parole violation review was being scheduled. Not a hearing yet, a review. But the review would look at the complaint and at Curtis's conditions and at the nature of the original offense, And if the review found sufficient concern, there would be a hearing, and if the hearing went against him, he would be back inside to serve the remainder of his sentence under the original terms. "Tell me what you found," Lundeen said. Curtis closed his eyes. He was sitting on a sleeping bag on the floor of a manager's office in a condemned movie theater in a town of 500 people, and he was being asked to explain that the building he owned contained a hidden room full of 40 years of photographs of the town's families, taken in secret by a dead projectionist who had never told anyone, and that among those photographs were pictures of Curtis himself at 17, taken from across the street by a man who thought Curtis was his missing son, and that Curtis had found all of this by tracing a piece of conduit that only an electrician would have noticed, using skills that had put him in prison. "I can't explain it over the phone," Curtis said. "Then explain it at the review," Lundeen said. "March 22nd, county offices in Marshall. Bring whatever you have." March 22nd was 12 days away. Curtis hung up and sat in the dark, and understood that he was caught in a problem that had no clean solution. He could show the review board the hidden room and the photographs, which would prove he was not stripping copper. But showing the photographs meant showing private family photographs, photographs of people's grandparents and children and weddings and funerals, to a parole review board, which would put them into a government record, which was exactly the kind of exposure Richard Engdahl had spent 40 years building a hidden room to prevent. The photographs were not Curtis's to show. They belonged to the families in them, or to Richard Engdahl's memory, or to the town, or to no one. They did not belong in a parole file, and he could not explain what he had found without showing it. The conduit and the solar panels in the hidden room were the evidence that he was not stealing copper. Without them, he was an electrician convicted of copper theft in a condemned building with a hole in the wall and a pry bar in his hand. The story, without the ending, was a crime in progress. He thought about it for 3 days. He did not go back into the hidden room. He did not go onto the roof. He stayed inside the theater, ate his canned soup, lay on his sleeping bag, and thought. On the third day, a Monday, he drove to the Ivanhoe Public Library. The library was a small brick building on 2nd Street, one room, with a children's section in the back and a single desk at the front, and behind the desk was a woman who looked up when Curtis came in and did not look away. Her name was Anita Vogt. She was 74. She had retired as the town's librarian 6 years earlier, but still came in 3 mornings a week, because the woman who replaced her worked the other 4, and the library could not afford 2 salaries. Anita was small and straight-backed, and wore her white hair in a braid that came over one shoulder, and she had the kind of eyes that settle on a person and stay. The eyes of a woman who has spent her life reading, and has learned to read people the same way she reads books, from the first line forward, reserving judgment until the story earns it. "You're the one in the theater," she said. "Yes, ma'am. People are talking about you." "I know what they're saying. They're saying you're stripping the wiring, are you?" "No." Anita looked at him a moment longer. Then she said, "Sit down. Tell me what you're doing in there." Curtis sat down at the reading table across from the desk, and he told her. Not everything, not the boy at the mobile folder or the note about David's hands, but the conduit, and the hidden room, and the filing cabinets, and the photographs. He told her that Richard Engdahl had built a darkroom inside the west wall of the theater, and had spent 40 years photographing the town, and that nobody had known, and that the room was still there, and that it was climate-controlled, and that the archive was complete and organized and intact. Anita Vogt sat very still while he talked. She did not interrupt. When he was finished, she was quiet for what felt like a long time, and then she did something Curtis did not expect. She sat down hard in the chair behind the desk, the way a person sits when their legs stop holding them, and she put her hand over her mouth, and her eyes filled, and she said in a voice that was not steady, Richard wasn't just showing movies. The movies were his excuse to keep the lights on. She knew him. She had known Richard Engdahl for 40 years. She had posed for his photographs, though she had not known what he was doing with them. She had brought him casseroles after his wife died, and after David disappeared, and through the long, slow years when Richard grew old behind the ticket counter of a theater that fewer and fewer people came to. She had believed, when the theater was condemned and the building sealed, that whatever Richard had kept inside was gone, destroyed, hauled to the landfill with the rotting seats and the broken projectors. She had not known about the room, She had not known about the archive. She had not known that the man she had fed casseroles to for 20 years had been building, in the dark, a complete visual history of the town he lived in, and that the history was still there, still warm, still waiting. He never said a word, she said. Not a single word. I sat in that theater 100 times and watched a movie, and he was upstairs with a camera, and I never knew. He photographed you, Curtis said. Anita looked at him sharply. How do you know? There's a folder with your name on it. She was quiet again. Then she said, show me. He drove her to the theater. It was a 4-block walk, but Anita's hip was bad and the sidewalks were icy. And Curtis was careful with her in the way a man is careful with someone who has just agreed to believe him, and whom he cannot afford to drop. He parked out front and let her in through the lobby, and walked her through the auditorium, past the rows of moldering seats, to the west wall, and helped her through the opening he had cut. Anita stood in the hidden room and did not speak for a full minute. She looked at the filing cabinets. She looked at the darkroom bench. She looked at the charge controller and the dehumidifier, and the digital thermometer reading 57 degrees. Then she walked to the first cabinet and opened the first drawer, and her hand went to her mouth, and she stood there. Anita, Curtis said, because he did not know what else to say. I'm all right, she said, and she was not. But she was the kind of woman who says she is all right, and means she is going to be all right. Once she finishes standing here with her hand over her mouth, and the whole weight of what she is looking at finishes landing on her, she pulled a folder from the drawer. It was labeled Lindgren, Wedding, 1971. She opened it and looked at the prints inside, and her breath caught, and she said, that's Carl and Donna Lindgren. I was a bridesmaid at that wedding. I was 23 years old. She held the photograph at arm's length, the way you hold something when your eyes are filling and you cannot see it close. Richard took this. He took this and he never showed it to anyone. She went through 3 more folders. The town's 4th of July parade in 1975, the children in red wagons and the fire truck and the high school band marching past the grain elevator. A winter photograph of Main Street taken from the roof of the theater, the snow deep and blue in the shadows, and the streetlights making halos in the cold air. A portrait of an old farmer, his name written on the back in Richard's hand, Olaf Thorson, 1983, and Anita said, Olaf died in 89. His family has no pictures of him. They looked and looked after the funeral, and there was nothing. Curtis stood by the door and let her look. He did not rush her. He understood, in the way a man understands who has been without a thing long enough to recognize its value, that what Anita was seeing was not just photographs. It was proof that the town she had lived in her whole life had been cared about by someone she thought she knew, in a way she had not imagined. And the proof had been behind a wall for 15 years, and the wall had been in a building everyone had written off, and the building had been given to a man everyone had written off, and the whole chain of writing off had somehow led to this moment, to a retired librarian standing in a hidden room in a condemned theater, holding a picture of a bride from 1971. Then Curtis showed her the David folder. Anita knew the story. Everyone in Ivanhoe over a certain age knew the story, the way a town of 500 people knows its losses, which is completely and forever. David Engdahl had been 22 when he disappeared. It was August of 1979. He had been working at the grain elevator that summer and riding a Honda motorcycle he had bought with his first season's pay, and one night he rode out and did not come back. No note, no call, no body found. The highway patrol looked, the county looked, Richard looked, driving the roads for weeks, knocking on doors in towns David had mentioned, towns along the highway where a young man on a motorcycle might have stopped. Nothing. David Engdahl had ridden into the night, and the night had kept him. Richard's wife, Margaret, died in 1985, 6 years after David disappeared. Anita said the word died and left whatever was behind it unsaid. After Margaret was gone, Richard was alone in the apartment above the theater, and he ran the projector, and he sold the tickets, and he came down to the Lutheran church on Sunday mornings, and sat in the back and left before the coffee. And the town understood, in the way small towns understand these things, that Richard Engdahl had been hollowed out by the 2 people who left him, and that the theater was the only thing still holding him to the ground. I brought him food, Anita said, every Thursday, a casserole or a soup. I'd sit with him in the lobby while he ate, and he'd talk about the movies, never about David, never about Margaret, always the movies. What was playing this week? What was coming next? Did I know that the projector needed a new lamp, and a lamp cost $400? The movies were what he talked about. I thought they were all he had. She looked at the filing cabinets. 40 years. They weren't all he had. The movies were what he showed people. This was what he kept. Curtis showed her the boy at the mobile folder last. He had not planned to show it to anyone, because it was the most private thing in the archive. More private than the family portraits and the funeral photographs and the flood pictures, because it was the place where Richard's grief and Curtis's life had crossed without either of them knowing it. But Anita needed to understand why the county had matched Curtis to this building, if the county had matched him, or if it had been coincidence, or if it had been something else, some thread too thin to see but strong enough to hold. Anita looked at the photographs of Curtis at 17. She looked at the note about David's hands. She read the entry about the arrest. Then she set the folder down on the filing cabinet, carefully, and she looked at Curtis with the directness of a woman who has spent her life in a library and has never been afraid of a true sentence. Richard never arranged for you to get this building, she said. He couldn't have. He died before the settlement. But he saw you. He saw you when you were 17 and you had no idea anyone was looking. And whatever the county did with its paperwork and its assessments, it doesn't matter. You are standing in this room because a man across the street cared enough to photograph a boy at a gas pump, and the caring didn't save either of you, but it kept a record, and the record is what matters. She paused. It always is. Then Anita Vogt went home and called Dan Lundeen. Curtis did not know she had called until Lundeen drove out from Marshall the following Thursday, 6 days before the scheduled review, and asked to see the building. Curtis let him in. He showed him the conduit on the west wall, the solar panels on the roof, the breaker panel, the hidden room, the filing cabinets. He did not show him the boy at the mobile folder. He did not need to. Anita had already told Lundeen what the room was and who Richard Engdahl was, and that Curtis was not stripping copper but had found something that had been hidden for 40 years, and that she would swear to it. Lundeen walked the room. He opened a drawer, looked at the photographs inside, and closed it. He looked at Curtis. You found this because you saw the conduit. I found it because I'm an electrician, Curtis said. Nobody else would have looked at that conduit twice. Lundeen was quiet a moment. He was a parole officer, not a philosopher. But he was not a stupid man, and the irony was not lost on him. The skill that had gotten Curtis convicted was the skill that had found the archive. The hands that had stripped copper were the hands that had traced the wiring and opened the wall and uncovered 40 years of a dead man's secret work. And the town, seeing those hands at work, had seen exactly what it expected to see, because the town had 3 words for Curtis, and 3 words was enough. I'm going to recommend the review be dropped, Lundeen said. The complaint was based on a misunderstanding. What you're doing in here is not criminal. It's not even close. He looked around the room one more time. But you're going to need to figure out what to do with all of this, Curtis, because it's not yours to keep, and it's not yours to throw away, and sooner or later, someone other than Anita Vogt is going to find out it's here. Sooner came before later. Anita, who was a librarian to her bones, and who understood the value of an archive the way Curtis understood the value of a circuit, had mentioned the photographs to one person, and that person had mentioned them to 2. And by the following week, the whole town knew, and by the week after that, Curtis received a phone call from a woman at the University of Minnesota. Her name was Dr. Sarah Lindholm, and she was an archivist in the university's Department of American Studies, and she had heard about the Engdahl archive through a chain of contacts that started with a professor at Southwest Minnesota State who had heard about it from a cousin in Ivanhoe, and she wanted to see it, and Curtis said she could come. She came on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of March, driving a university car from Minneapolis 5 hours. And she brought an assistant and a pair of cotton gloves. And the particular excitement of a person who studies the past for a living, and has just learned that a piece of it has been sitting in a wall for 15 years. Curtis showed her the room the way he had shown Anita, which was to let her in and stand by the door and say nothing. Dr. Lindholm went through the cabinets for 4 hours. Her assistant took notes. They did not remove anything. When they were finished, Dr. Lindholm stood in the middle of the room and took off her cotton gloves and looked at Curtis and said, "This is one of the most complete photographic records of a single rural community in the upper Midwest. that I've ever seen. It's 40 years of social history, undisturbed, organized by the photographer himself. It belongs in a proper archive." "What does that mean?" Curtis asked. "It means the university would like to acquire it. The complete collection. Negatives, prints, notebooks, equipment, everything in this room transferred to our archive, properly cataloged, digitized, made available to researchers and to the public. We would cover the cost of transfer, preservation, and digitization. And we would make an acquisition payment to you as the owner." "How much?" $120,000. Curtis stood in the doorway of the hidden room and heard the number. $120,000 was more money than he had ever imagined having. It was more than 10 times what the county had paid him for 2 years of his life. It was enough to fix the theater or sell it and start over anywhere in the country. Enough to go back to school and finish the apprenticeship. Enough to buy a truck that did not knock on cold starts and a coat that did not smell like a prison box. $120,000 for photographs a dead man had taken of a town that did not know they existed. "There's a condition," Dr. Lindholm said. "The acquisition has to be complete, everything in the room. The integrity of the archive depends on its completeness. We can't take a partial collection. All or nothing. All or nothing. The complete archive, including the David folder and the Boy at the Mobile folder, transferred to the University of Minnesota, cataloged, digitized, and made available to researchers and to the public. The photographs of David Engdahl at the lake and at the county fair and on his motorcycle. The photographs of Curtis Rask at 17, pumping gas in a mobile jacket, taken without his knowledge by a man who thought he was someone else. The note about David's hands. The entry about the arrest. All of it, public, searchable. $120,000 worth of a dead man's grief and a boy's face, and a secret that had been kept in the dark for a reason. Curtis thought about it for 5 days. He thought about it in the manager's office on his sleeping bag, and he thought about it in the hidden room standing between the filing cabinets, and he thought about it driving to Tyler for groceries, and he thought about it lying in the truck in the parking lot of the co-op, staring at the prairie sky. He thought about what $120,000 would do for his life, which was everything. He thought about what the photographs would do in a university archive, which was become searchable and public and permanent and available to anyone with a library card and an internet connection. He thought about the families whose christenings and funerals and weddings were in those cabinets, who had not been asked whether they wanted their private moments made public. He thought about the Thorson family, who had no pictures of Olaf. He thought about the Lindgren wedding that Anita had been a bridesmaid at. He thought about David's face at the lake, and he thought about himself at 17, eating a sandwich on the curb of a gas station, and the fact that Richard Engdahl had watched him and photographed him and written about his hands, and that this act of watching was the most intimate thing that had ever happened to Curtis, and it had happened without his knowledge, and putting it in a public archive would turn it into data, and data is the opposite of intimate, and the whole point of the room was that it was not data. The whole point was that it was a man's private record of the fact that he could not stop looking at the world, because looking was how he kept it from disappearing. And making it public would be doing to Richard exactly what the court had done to Curtis, which was to take a private act and turn it into a public record and let the public decide what it meant. Curtis called Dr. Lindholm on the 5th day. "I can't do it," he said. There was a pause on the line. "The offer is very generous, Mr. Rask. The university is prepared to be flexible on terms. It's not the money," Curtis said. "It's the all or nothing. I can't hand over private photographs of families without asking them. And some of the photographs in that archive are personal. They were taken by a man who was grieving, and they were kept in the dark because they were meant to be in the dark, and I don't have the right to put them in the light. The archive loses its scholarly value if it's incomplete. Then it loses its scholarly value." He hung up. $120,000 gone. The largest sum of money he would ever be offered in his life, probably, refused, by a man with $5,300 in a checking account, and a sleeping bag on the floor of a condemned building. Curtis sat in the manager's office, and looked at his hands and thought about Richard Engdahl's note about David's hands and about the word reaching, and he did not know whether he had done the right thing or the stupid thing, and he suspected the answer was both. He went to Anita the next morning and told her what he had done, and what he wanted to do instead. "I want to give the photographs back," he said, "to the families. Every family that has a folder in that archive. I want to find them and show them what Richard took and let them have the prints if they want them. The negatives stay. The archive stays. But the photographs of people's grandparents and children and weddings and funerals should belong to the people in them. Not to me and not to a university." Anita looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "That's going to take a while." "I've got time," Curtis said. "I've got nothing but time." They started the following week. Anita knew every family in the archive, or had known them, or knew someone who knew them. She sat in the hidden room with Curtis, drawer by drawer, folder by folder, and identified the people in the photographs, and Curtis wrote the names down. And together they began the slow work of sorting 40 years of a town's life into piles that could be given back. The first family came on a Saturday, the Lindgrens. Carl Lindgren had died in 2011, but Donna was still alive, 81, living with her daughter in Marshall. And Anita called her, and Donna drove out with her daughter and her granddaughter, and stood in the hidden room behind the west wall of the Palace Theater, and looked at her own wedding photographs for the first time in her life and wept. Not the crying of sadness. The crying of a woman who has just been handed a picture of herself at 23, in a dress she gave away 30 years ago, standing next to a man she loved, taken by a man she barely knew, saved in a room she did not know existed, and the picture is sharp, and the light is good, and the girl in the photograph has no idea that any of it will end. Curtis stood by the door while Donna Lindgren looked at her wedding photographs, and he felt the same thing he had felt in the hidden room the first time, which was the floor tilting, the sense of standing at the edge of something much larger than himself, and not knowing where the edge was. They came after that in a steady stream. The Olsons, the Schmidts, the Nguyen's, who had run a small restaurant on Main Street in the 80s and had no photographs of it. The Thorsons, who had looked and looked after Olaf died and had found nothing, and who now had 12 prints of their father and grandfather, in a field on a tractor, at the co-op counter, leaning against a fence post the way David Engdahl had leaned against a fence post, the way Curtis Rask had leaned against a gas pump, the universal lean of a man standing still between tasks with no idea that anyone is watching. Curtis gave each family their photographs. He kept nothing. He asked nothing. He did not ask for money and would not have accepted it. Some families brought food. One woman brought a pie. A man named Erling Thorson, Olaf's grandson, came with a thermos of coffee and stayed 3 hours, looking at pictures of a grandfather he had never met, and when he left he shook Curtis's hand and said, "I don't know what you did to end up in that prison, and I don't care. This is the most decent thing anybody has ever done for my family." It was Anita who told the tornado siren story. They were sitting in the theater lobby on folding chairs Curtis had bought at a church sale for $2 each, and Anita was drinking the coffee Erling had left, and she said, "You know, the town didn't know about the siren either." Curtis did not know what she was talking about. "The tornado siren," Anita said, "the one on the pole behind the co-op. The county defunded its maintenance in the 90s, budget cuts. Nobody picked it up, but every Saturday at noon it went off, the test signal, the way it always had. And the batteries stayed charged, and the motor stayed oiled, and the thing worked. And nobody asked why, because it had always worked, and who thinks about a thing that works?" She paused. "Richard maintained it for 25 years after the county stopped paying for it. He climbed up there and oiled the motor and replaced the batteries and tested it every Saturday, and nobody knew. 2 winters after he died, a tornado watch was issued, and the siren didn't sound. The motor had seized. 3 houses were damaged. The roof came off the old Stavros place on 3rd Street. And nobody knew it was Richard until the hardware store found a box of siren parts in their back room with Richard's name on the receipt. Curtis sat with that. A man who maintained a tornado siren for 25 years without telling anyone, and photographed a town for 40 years without telling anyone, and saw a boy at a gas station, and thought he was someone he'd lost and never said a word. A man who held the town together with his hands and never told the town he was holding it, and the town did not know until the hands were gone and the things they held started falling. He wasn't showing movies, Curtis said, repeating what Anita had said the first day. The movies were his excuse to keep the lights on. The lights and the camera and the siren and everything else, Anita said. He was the man who held it all together, and nobody knew, and he wanted it that way. Because if you're holding a thing together, and you tell people you're holding it, then it's about you. And it was never about Richard, it was about the town. Curtis did not reopen the theater that spring, but he began. He cleared the auditorium, seat by seat, hauling the rotting cushions and broken frames to a dumpster he rented for $340 that he paid out of his checking account, which by now was down to $4,600 and dropping. He paid $112 to have the electric meter reset and the utility service turned back on in his name, and retired the pawn shop generator to the storage room. He patched the roof, or the worst of it, with materials the hardware store sold him at cost, because Jerry Eliasson had seen his own parents' wedding photograph come out of the archive, and had decided that Curtis Rask was not what 3 words said he was. He got the projection booth open. The padlock yielded to a hacksaw, and inside was the old projector, a century, covered in dust but intact, and 2 boxes of film cans, and a pair of reading glasses on the shelf beside the projector's viewfinder, and a thermos. And Curtis stood there, looking at the thermos and the glasses, and understood that these were the last things Richard Engdahl had touched, before he went downstairs and closed the theater for the last time and walked to his apartment upstairs and did not come down again. The town helped, not all of it, not the man in the county truck, and not Karen Olson across the street, who still crossed to the other side when Curtis was outside, but enough of it. Erling Thorson came with his brother and pulled the old seats out. A woman named Gloria Schmidt, whose mother's funeral photographs had been in the archive, brought a crew of her husband's workers to patch the plaster on the water-damaged wall. The Lutheran church donated folding chairs for the front rows. The hardware store put a sign in the window, Palace Theater reopening, summer. Someone, Curtis never found out who, left a check for $500 in the mail slot of the theater's front door, in an envelope with no name on it, only the words, "For Richard." Curtis kept the David folder and the boy at the mobile folder in the filing cabinet. He did not give them away. He did not show them to anyone except Anita. They were not his to give, and not his to display, and not the town's business. They were a father's grief and a stranger's face. And they belonged in the dark, in the room the father had built. Because some records are kept not for the public but for the keeper, and the keeping is the point. He showed his first movie on a Saturday night in June, the ground thawed, and the prairie green and the evening light lasting until 9. It was an old movie, one of the films from the cans in the projection booth, and Curtis had taught himself to run the Century projector from a manual he found online, and the film was scratched, and the sound was thin, and the picture jumped in the gate, and the folding chairs were not comfortable, and the lobby smelled like fresh plaster and old popcorn, and 43 people came. 43 people in a town of 500 on a Saturday night to sit in folding chairs in a condemned theater and watch a movie that none of them had seen before and all of them had heard of, projected by a man with a felony and a sleeping bag, and $6,000 less than he'd started with, in a building the county had tried to give away. They came because the photographs had given them back something they did not know they had lost, and because the man who gave them back had refused $120,000 to do it, and because the theater, for the first time in 15 years, had its lights on, and the lights were the same lights Richard Engdahl had kept on for 40 years, not to show movies but to keep the place alive, so that the room would be there when the town needed it. Curtis stood in the projection booth and watched the light hit the screen through the small window. The same window Richard Engdahl had watched through for 40 years. The same window he had photographed the town through. The same window he had looked out of on the morning they arrested the boy at the gas station across the street. The projector hummed. The film stuttered and caught and ran. Below him in the auditorium, 43 people sat in the dark and watched, and Curtis watched them watching, and he thought about a man who had spent his life doing exactly this, standing in this booth, looking through this window, holding a town in his hands without the town knowing it was held. There are people who see you when nobody else does. Richard Engdahl saw a boy at a gas station and thought he was someone he'd lost. He was wrong about who Curtis was. He was right about what Curtis would do.